So I think I'm in. Welcome everyone. Thanks a lot for participating to this meeting about agronutrition and health in space. So it's going to be quite interesting. My name is Lucy Campagnolo. I'm working for MEDES, which is the Institute for Space Medicine and Physiology located in Toulouse in France. And I'm also working for the French Space Agency and Connect by CNES. We are very happy to host you today. So we'll have quite a busy webinar. We will start with an overview of why are we giving this webinar, what is MEDES, what is Connect by CNES, and we would like to thank particularly our sponsor for today, which is the Clubster NSL, which is represented by Anne-Charlotte Poupin. Thank you very much. And then we will go deep a little bit more into the technical details with our other partner, Space Commerce Matters. Is going to talk about the specificity of space environment, what can be accepted for industrial partner in the agronutrition and health field, what kind of experiments have been performed already in space, and what can we learn from this experiment. And then we will have a panel discussion, and we are very happy to welcome Mark Kugel from URI, a German company, and Hilde Steenhuit from Ice Cubes, also working in the space field, but in Belgium. So I suggest that we start right now. And Jonathan, may I ask you to move to the next slide, please?
Are we there?
Not yet on my screen. Do you see the next slide?
I can see the next slide, Lucy.
You can see the next slide. Okay, I don't remember what the next slide is.
Yeah, let's see if it's a take.
Take a little bit time on my side. And no worries, I'm going to improvise. Perfect, now it's working.
Good.
So what is space? When we talk about space, what are we talking about? Space is quite vast, but here we are really focusing on what we call low Earth orbit, which is approximately 400 kilometers above our head. And in particular, we are looking at an infrastructure that is well known, which is the International Space Station. And we can see it as a laboratory in microgravity, which is quite unique. So you can see in this picture one astronaut that is performing research, and this is it's usually done in space. It's fundamental research for scientific purposes. But next slide, please. Lately, we have seen lots of new opportunity for commercial ventures, whether it's space tourism, you may have seen that in the news, or new private space station, but also new infrastructure dedicated to industrial research in microgravity. And this is what we are going to talk about. Why is it important for our topic today? It's the fact that it's quicker, it's versatile, we can have very specialized instruments in space that allow to do cutting-edge research in the field of life science. And this is what we are going to explain today. Next slide, please. So, if we look at this schematic, we are really focusing here on the European market. And you have the life science industry that can be quite broad. So today we are going to talk about nutrition that is performing plant innovation or innovation for terrestrial purposes. And what we would like to add to the picture is the opportunity to also use the International Space Station and all the space service providers that are working with the International Space Station to perform some innovation that can be then re-download on Earth and can benefit the innovation that is already planned by the industrial. And how are we going to do that? It's due to this unique low Earth orbit environment that is going to be detailed just after. And this has a double purposes because what is performed in space can be useful also for space exploration when we talk about Moon and Mars mission. But the primary focus, it's really how it can be used on Earth and increase the economic data from the industry. Next slide, please. So it's not changing on my screen, but if my memory is good, it's a presentation of... It's MEDES.
Yeah.
So we at MEDES. Maybe you have heard about MEDES. We are an economic group of interest, and our two main members are the French Space Agency and Toulouse Hospital. And the goal of MEDES is really to make the bridge between space science and healthcare industry. And we do that with three sectors. Next slide, please. The first sector is that we provide operational support for space physiology experiments made by the astronauts, but also we propose medical preparation, training, follow-up for the astronaut to guarantee their health on board when they are doing exploration mission. Our second activity is linked to clinical research. We operate a clinical infrastructure where we mimic microgravity by having some subjects lying down for a certain amount of time during clinical protocols. And with that, we can artificially reproduce the effect of microgravity on some physiological subsystem of the body, namely the bones, the muscle loss, immunity deficiency, and so on. And we can, on fake astronauts, we can test what we call countermeasure. For example, it could be a special diet that could prevent muscle loss, or it could be specific exercise protocol, or also the use of new molecules or drugs in order to counter the effect of the space environment on the body, but without going to space. And our last sector, it's innovation and application, and it's exactly what we are trying to do here. It's really to make the people working in the space sector speaking with the people working in the life science sector, because we are usually working in parallel, and there is lots of commonality and common challenge and expertise and knowledge that can be exchanges in order to foster new ideas and to accelerate the innovation. Next slide, please. So I guess it's the Connect Bikeness program.
Yep.
So the Connect Bikeness program, it's an initiative that is held by the French Space Agency. And the idea, it's a little bit the same, but we are not targeting only life science industry, but also environmental company and people working in the field of transport. And what we wanted, it was really to be more working with different sectors, because we thought that there is lots of space data and space knowledge that could benefit industrial sector, but they just don't know that we exist and how to use this data, how to use this knowledge, how to implement it in their product. So next slide, please. So to do that, we are organized at the French Space Agency into a range of service offer. First of all, we do lots of promotion and webinars, and this is part of this initiative. We also work with the ESA Business Incubation Center in order to provide funding and expertise to startups that want to implement space data. We propose expertise for any kind of actor that would like to perform something in space. So, for example, if today one of you has a specific experiment that he wants to implement in space, but is lacking a certain expertise, we try to find within the French Space Agency one or two experts that can help you to really have something that is realistic. We also work with some funding mechanism. So space ticket, it's operated by the French Tech, and we try to push some company to this funding opportunity. Pulsar is by the European Space Agency, and we also have the Cosmic Capital, which is for higher funding needs for space tech. Finally, we offer free training several times a year to really acquire the basic of satellite data, geolocalization, Earth observation, and satellite telecommunication. It's for everyone, and it's really help you understand what can be done with the space technology. Next slide, please. So I will give the floor to Anne-Charlotte Pupin, and thank you very much again, NSL, for being our sponsor today.
Thank you very much, Lucie, for bringing us on board for this webinar. So I'm Anne-Charlotte Pupin. I'm managing the competitiveness cluster called Cluster NSL for nutrition, health, and longevity. Next slide, please, Jonathan. So we are a professional network gathering more than 300 members that are mainly industrial companies, academic researchers, healthcare, hospitals or services, and care institutions. And our members are very active in the field of agronutrition from one side and healthcare as a whole. And we have the specificity, we're located in northern France, in Lille, and we have the specificity in our region to have a high density of big players that have intensive R&D in the field of innovative ingredients for nutritional purposes, such as Le Safre, Roquette, Ingredia, which makes then our ecosystem very promising and intensive in terms of generating new ingredients, looking into better understanding the role of nutrition in the body and preventive care. If you go to the next slide, please, Jonathan. So our role as a cluster is to federate and stimulate our different members in order to boost their innovation, to give them more opportunity to network on different kind of topics and to boost their development. So how we do that is mostly by matchmaking events, webinar to share new opportunities, new trends of innovation and of business development, and support in identifying the right funding throughout the innovation progress from the lab to the market. Can you go to the next slide, please, Jonathan? So looking to, if we take a step back and look into what are the key topics in which our members are very active today, we do find many keywords that we had the opportunity to discuss with CNES when preparing this webinar, and which gave us the feeling that it was a good partner to go with. So there's a lot of intensive research to better understand the microbiome, the gut one, but also all the other microbiome from the plants, from the animals, from the skin. And that means understanding the ecosystem of the microbiome, understanding the interaction with the body, and developing a lot of innovative, applying new technologies of analysis, of analytical tools to better understand this. So we have the One Health approach. We work more and more into personalized nutrition and personalized health, in the development of innovative ingredients and the formulation that go with it. And how does all this can benefit for the prevention and the management of chronic diseases, be it obesity, diabetes, or neurodegenerative diseases mainly. So if you move to the next slide, we as well are co-organizing 4 European matchmaking events dedicated to innovation. So BioFit for the biotechnology, Nutrivant dedicated to nutrition, Aging Fit for the aging economy, and MedFit for the medical devices. The purpose of these events is to have the opportunity for startup, early R&D player and academics to meet and match during these times in order to develop new partnerships, new innovation programs, and drive the innovations to the market. Next slide, please, Jonathan. So
all right.
Cynthia?
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. Next slide, please. So I'm Cindy Buteau and president of Space Commerce Matters, and we've been working with Lucy and her team, you know, I think for the past year, and looking at a lot of these areas that overlap with terrestrial applications that have space application as well. And I think Anne Charlotte actually just provided a great example of what those areas are. And what we're going to do right now is really dive into why space. Why, if you're working in nutrition or life science or health or food and beverage, why should you think about space? And these are really the three top line points. It's the new science and innovation, the higher quality research and development and manufacturing products. There's currently commercial opportunity, and we'll give you a little view of some of that in terms of incremental revenue or new product offerings. And then ultimately the marketing and branding. Next, please. Next, yeah. I think Lucy touched a little bit where she said, you know, low Earth orbit, this first area, is only about 400 kilometers above the Earth. It's where the International Space Station orbits, and it's where the majority of the satellites orbit. We're hearing a lot these days about ESA and CNES and other space agencies really focusing on the moon, Mars, and beyond, on the exploration agenda. And the result of this is really the looking at low Earth orbit as a new marketplace where we're looking for commercial opportunity. And again, that's what we're here to discuss today. Next slide. We have traditionally focused or heard a lot about the supply side. So we hear about SpaceX and Axiom with new models or modules, and Boeing with their new crew vehicle, with the ESA Space Rider as a new manufacturing system. Yuri is going to talk in a little bit with their new space factories. So a lot has been done on what we call the supply side. But on the next slide, what we want to really be talking about today is what about the demand side? What is being done right now with food and beverage companies, with farmers looking at raw materials, with the life scientists? And what we're talking about is the creation of novel materials and better manufactured products. We're doing currently a lot of drug development and delivery systems in low Earth orbit, crop science, remote sensing, and satellite technology. And again, we're going to be giving very concrete examples today. Next slide. As mentioned before, why would you go to space? What we've been doing is measuring economic innovation and humankind benefit. And we actually can really address and measure very tangible benefits from doing something in space. Next slide, please. And these are just some of the companies that have been doing this type of work. We see a lot of the life science in terms of drug discovery and development and cellular biology and regenerative medicine. As Anne Charlotte just talked about, the microbiome and some of those, the omics and genomics areas, and Molly giving some examples of those. In the consumer products and industrial categories, looking at a lot of the sort of materials areas and physical science, transport phenomena and interfacial phenomena. And then our favorite area is looking at the sustainability, the climate change, ocean health, water efficiency, which really all relate to the environment and could very well, relate to what we're talking today in terms of nutrition. Next slide, please. The industries and the research areas are very broad. Obviously, food and beverage, as we're talking about today, and nutrition, life science, consumer products, and as we just mentioned, all the way from plant science through cell biology and genomics. Next slide. Right now, we're seeing lots of coalitions coming together looking at sustainability programs, looking at open innovation competitions. And I think when Lucy comes back to speak about how to engage, you know, there are opportunities to look at these competitions and solicitations as a way to, you know, sort of dip your toe into the water of working in space. Next slide, please. And so quickly, we're going to now talk about the scientific benefits. So Jonathan, next slide. Really, there are three primary reasons in terms of why you would go and do anything in low Earth orbit. The first one, the one that we're going to be talking mostly about, is microgravity, and really the impact that has on the physical and life sciences, from fluid physics to all of the, you know, combustion and physical and life science sort of fundamental behaviors. And again, Jonathan and Molly will be giving you very detailed examples of those. The second criteria, or the phenomena, is on the next slide, which is the extreme conditions. When you go outside in the raw elements, so say you go outside of the International Space Station or outside of one of these new free flyers that are coming online, what really takes decades to degrade here on Earth could take weeks or months in low Earth orbit because of those extreme conditions. The thermal cycling, oxygen, the vacuum, the debris impact, the radiation really has a tremendous impact on this type of accelerated degradation and material type testing. And then the third phenomena is the one we typically hear the most about, which is the vantage point. And so, you know, looking at that 400 kilometers overhead, the ISS and other applications and platforms have an orbital path that covers about 90% of the Earth's population every few days. So a great vantage point for Earth observation and remote sensing applications. And over to you, Molly and Jonathan, to talk about specifically what the applications are related to our topic today.
Great, thank you, Cindy. So crystallization is a very important and heavily utilized research area on the International Space Station, whether it be growing protein crystals or looking for new targets for significant diseases, drug discovery, formulation and delivery, or biomarker discovery. We perform crystallization in microgravity because the lack of gravity allows crystals to grow larger with a more ordered structure. We don't have sedimentation. It's a diffusion-driven environment. Next slide, Jonathan. Cell biology is also very interesting in microgravity. In microgravity, cells' behavior tends to be more like that in the human body. 3D structures can form without the use of a scaffolding or matrix, and we see changes in gene expression. And we can work on everything in this area, from tissue chips to 3D cell culturing to 3D bioprinting, stem cells, regenerative medicine, and much more. Next slide, Jonathan. Microorganisms are also very interesting in microgravity. The reason is the diffusion-driven environment of microgravity seems to induce changes in the behavior and virulence of various microorganisms. We can see yeast produce different secondary metabolites. Biofilms form that are stronger and thicker and have a different shape than they do on the ground. Bacteria, as we said, can become more virulent. So it's a very interesting environment to look at these microorganisms, whether we're using them to produce materials for nutrition or health, or if we're just looking at changes in their behavior to understand things like antibiotic resistance on the ground. Next slide, please, Jonathan. We can also use space, as Lucy talked about, to model various diseases. Astronauts in the microgravity environment seem to have muscle and bone loss. They experience immune dysfunction. We can also look at things like how cancer tumors form and cancer cells move and migrate. We can create organoids or microorgans in space, and we can also do research with model organisms on the International Space Station, such as rodents. Next slide, Jonathan, thanks. And I think this is another really interesting one related to nutrition, which is plant science. Plants that we know every day grow in a gravity-driven environment. So when you bring them to space, you can learn some new things, whether it's how the plants respond in terms of stress to the microgravity environment. It's how the roots don't necessarily grow straight down anymore because the water could be in different places. We can also look at plant microbe interaction, and looking at changes in a plant's gene expression can allow us to understand how to create plants that are more drought resistant or more tolerant to salt. And then using yet one of the other phenomenon, we can actually observe the earth and use it for crop monitoring and water monitoring. And Jonathan, I think turn it over to you now.
Yep, thanks, Molly. So I'm just going to go through some of the physical science benefits of the Leo phenomena. These first ones will focus on microgravity as well. So we look at material synthesis. Molly talked about crystallization, but really any type of material can benefit from formulating, whether it's for R&D or manufacturing in microgravity, because you can develop more ordered material structures. So on the molecular level, these material molecules form more uniformly without defects, and that can obviously relate to a stronger material, one with more optimal physical properties. And that's the case whether you're talking about a protein, but also a polymer, a composite, ceramic, metal, semiconductor. The whole gamut of materials can benefit from studying manufacturing in the microgravity environment. In addition to synthesis, you can also study material systems, measure their properties and behavior. Because of those gravitational forces being suppressed, you can more accurately model certain parameters like thermophysical properties, diffusion coefficients, etc., in modeling. And you can also study things like phase transitions in single or multi-material systems. We can also utilize the microgravity environment to look at fluids and transport. So by removing those gravitational forces, surface forces become more dominant, which is obviously good for looking at interfacial behavior, but also looking at things like surface tension, capillary flow, and also looking at how membranes affect separation and agglomeration without the presence of gravity. We can also do reaction chemistry. There's been recent added facilities on the space station that could potentially do flow chemistry as well as batch chemistry. We also utilize microgravity to look at mixing. How do things mix without density gradients and sedimentation? And we can also utilize the microgravity environment to study combustion, because the flame propagation method is purely diffusive, and that can make a difference in studying the combustion mechanism and learning more about that. Cindy already mentioned the external environment. That really relates to materials testing. How do materials fail? How do they degrade? How do they corrode? And that can occur much faster in space than on the Earth. And lastly, remote sensing. So we talk about the Vantage Point as it relates to agriculture and food and beverage. You can gather big data sets in all types of wavelengths, whether it's the visible band, infrared, or higher. That you can look at that for crop health, climate change, raw material identification, mapping, and obviously sustainability, which is very important across all industries, but especially in the agronutrition and health industry, using the Vantage Point to solve those big global sustainability challenges. So now we're just going to share with you just a few examples of actual flight projects that have flown to the space station and that are related to your sector. So I'll start with the first couple. And actually, the first one here, the PI, Vic Kiesler, will be on the panel talking about his project here in a couple minutes, just to give a high-level overview of it. Vic and his company, Champion X, looked at biofilm thickness in microgravity. Biofilms can grow much, much faster in that environment than they can on the ground, and that can enable more enhanced research to see how they impact things like oil and gas, which is important for Champion X. But as I'm sure you all know, biofilms are also critical in the food and beverage and the health industry. So it's a phenomenon that crosses multiple sectors. Another example is Procter & Gamble actually did a series of experiments involving colloidal stability. How do you increase the shelf life of products, whether it's food products, or in their cases, cleansers or detergents, household products, things like that. One of the things that causes shelf life to degrade is phase separation. And that's obviously on the ground driven by sedimentation. But there's other factors that cause phase separation, but you really can't study them on the ground because it's dominated by sedimentation. So by going into the microgravity environment, they can learn about the other forces that cause that phase separation. And P&G has done a number of experiments, and actually they've had a couple of patents awarded from their work in microgravity, and actually they're continuing to do further research in the coming years. They actually are working on, I believe it just came out in the last couple of weeks, a program that's going to involve studying Tide detergents and how they're affected by microgravity, and that program is going to last multiple years. So this is an example of a customer that's really utilized microgravity for many years and has made tremendous progress in advancing their product line on the ground because of their use of space. Another one, Eli Lilly did a series of experiments. One thing they did was looking at lyophilization or freeze drying. Obviously, in the food and beverage industry, that's a great way to preserve food, to make it obviously last longer, but also to transport it into remote areas. So the lyophilization process occurs very differently in microgravity. You get these layering and these textures on the ground that can cause degrade the product. So hopefully in microgravity, you can learn about how those forces are negated, how you can learn about those underlying mechanisms that are involved in the lyophilization process to potentially improve your processing on the ground to make a better freeze-dried product that potentially tastes better or lasts longer. And I'll turn it over to Molly for the last couple of examples.
All right, thanks, Jonathan. So speaking earlier about plants, Budweiser decided to look at barley seed germination in space, and they actually have done 3 experiments so far, and they've signed on to do 3 more experiments. But what they're really trying to understand is how the lack of gravitational forces influences the growth mechanisms and how that could potentially lead to a better structured strand of barley, which is not only used for human consumption, but also in livestock feed. And we care about this because plants grown in microgravity, those changes in gene expression, those changes in the root structure, the shoot growth, they can really help us understand how barley and other raw materials should be grown or developed on the ground, and can help aid in creating more stress-resistant strains of crops. Like I said earlier, it can help us understand salt salinity or salt tolerance. It can help us understand drought tolerance, and it could lead to increased crop production to feed our ever-growing population here on the ground. Next slide, Jonathan. And another interesting area of research is plant microbe interactions. So looking at how we can use bacteria or other microorganisms to really help plants grow. So instead of fertilizers and fungicides and insecticides, how can we look at that symbiotic relationship between plants and microbes and understand it for use in agricultural biologics, and again for improved plant growth instead of chemical fertilizers and other products, which also improves water and soil health. And we really look at this in space because microbes or microorganisms behave differently in space than they do on the ground in that diffusion-driven environment. So understanding how that symbiotic relationship changes or improves in space can help us develop better non-chemical based fertilizers. All right, next slide. Great. All right. I think I'll send this back over to Jonathan.
Yep. All right. So this is just a high-level overview of topics that could potentially benefit from the LEO environment in your sector. So at the end of this presentation in the appendix, people who attend this webinar will get this entire slide deck. At the end, we've included much more detailed value propositions for these different high-level topics in your sector of why Leo for these areas. So you see things like formulations. We talked about product stability. We touched on all these, especially in some of the examples, and obviously the panel will get into this a little more as well. So there's just high-level things to start thinking about, and obviously when you get the full slide deck, you'll be able to dive a little deeper into potential ideas that you guys could consider for Leo-based research. So I'll turn it back over to Lucy now for how do you engage.
Thank you very much, Oliver, for this presentation. We will have time to go into the detail during our panel session. I forgot to mention that if you have any questions, do not hesitate to ask them in the chat or in the special question and answer part of this application. So now, if you're interested, where do we start? The first thing that I would recommend is come to talk to us, either myself and my colleague Marie-Laure, that is also connected, but also like Jonathan, Cynthia, and Molly from Space Commerce Matters, Mark from Yuri, or Hilde from Ice Cube, or Anne-Charlotte. Do not hesitate to come to us with an idea, with a question, with a project, and we will take the time to work with you and to explain what is feasible, what makes sense, and to work together. If you have already an idea and a project, I see people in the audience that have already worked with CNES, that is well more advanced in terms of experiments. The idea is to try to shape it into a space experiment. And once again, we offer to work with you, to consolidate, to challenge your project, to work with experts in order to have a kind of outline proposal of a project that could be implemented. If you are interested, but you're not sure, or you would like to go deeper into one of the topics that we have just touched today, we can also do a specific keynote at your headquarters or at your clusters, at your facility, to work a little bit more into the topic, or to foster open innovation with your innovation team. So basically my message here is this is not an activity that can be done alone, because you have to have expertise in the space environment, in space exploration, human spaceflight, but we need your expertise in your particular topic, whether is it about disease or biomanufacturing or whatever. So this is only an activity that can be done together. And then in terms of timeline, what we are trying to do is to gather a portfolio of interesting projects. What do I mean with interesting projects? First of all, projects that are clear return of investment for terrestrial application, meaning that you know why you're doing it, why you engage resources from your company, and what you expect from your experiment in space. And this is something that needs multiple iteration to really focus the project. Second, is that a project that is feasible technically in space, but also within the time frame. Meaning that if you engage in a project that costs millions of euros and will take 5 years to implement, maybe it's not the right way to start. And then a project that can be a kind of a showroom for other companies that could have the same problem as yours, or like similar topic of interest, and that can benefit from your experiment as a pioneer in space to advance their strategy and to maybe work with you as a partner. So this is the kind of project we are looking for. We are really committed during the next year to go towards you and to work with you, so that we can show a very interesting portfolio of projects to the European Space Agency. I don't know, yeah, I think it's clear. Maybe next slide, Jonathan. So we have talked a lot about the terrestrial part of the top of the subject. Now it's time for to speak about space. So I will leave the floor. Yeah.
All right, thank you, Lucy. And so if you just go to the next slide, I think what Lucy just explained is really important. You know, I think there's a whole continuum. If you may have no idea whatsoever of what you could do in space, all the way through, you've already done some work in space, you're more advanced, and there's ways to really drive home the concepts that you really want to perform. Those concepts that really align with your business goals and your research goals, so that there is a return on investment. And what we're going to be talking about in just a few minutes with the panel is how do you do that? And what we wanted to show you here is, you know, there's a whole range of service providers that have the facilities and the capability to actually carry out your activity in space. You do not become a space expert if you don't want to. I mean, the folks like Yuri and Ice Cubes and others are those experts. the lab equipment, the manufacturing equipment, the processes that you use on the Earth are not going to be the ones you're going to use in space. And what these service providers have done is really made that translation for you, so that their facilities and their capability can support that list of project, concepts that Molly and Jonathan and Anne Charlotte actually presented at the beginning. There's quite a few areas, and again, we don't want to take up the time now, but that are really relevant for you, and the panel will be talking about it. So Yuri with Mark Kugel, who will be talking in a minute on the panel, is a great example of a service provider that has done a lot of work in this area. On the next slide, you have Ice Cubes, and again, lots of work in this life science and agronutrition area. There are other service providers, and you can just scroll through these, Jonathan. On the next slide, you have Bioreactor Express, Lamont Aerospace, and TechShot, all with the types of facilities that can translate how you do it here on the ground to how it would be executed in space. And on that note, why don't we introduce the panel, which, as we just said, Mark Kugel from Yuri and Hilda Stenuit from Space Application Services and Ice Cubes. They're the two service providers that have done so much in this area. And we're also very lucky to have an actual PI that has done work in low Earth orbit. So Vic Kiesler from Champion X, they're all here to share their experience. So thank you, Hilda, thank you, Mark, and thank you, Vic, for joining us. I'd actually like to start with Vic, and maybe you could just give a little bit of an overview of your organization and the project that you did, just to start off this panel.
Yeah, absolutely, Cynthia. Thank you so much for the opportunity to join the conversation today. It's really exciting to have the opportunity to probe questions in that microgravity environment that you can't do on Earth, right? And that was really what got us excited about doing the project. Our company works closely with oil and gas operators to really ensure that they maximize production and minimize risk. And one of the major risks that they deal with is microorganisms that come out of the reservoir and have the risk of making biofilms on the pipe surface. And as they create biofilms underneath that, there's a corrosive environment that is kicked off that can actually lead to a hole in the pipe. And so what we were trying to explore through our experiment was utilizing microgravity, which you heard a couple of times, that when you grow a biofilm in microgravity, you get some very unique characteristics. The biofilms have 5 to 10 times greater microbe numbers than in Earth gravity. The biomass is 40% increased. The actual thickness of the biofilm is 2 times greater than it is in Earth gravity. And so we were using the microgravity and Earth gravity comparison to really probe the mechanism of what is happening in the biofilm that's kicking off that corrosion process. And understanding that would really be a paradigm shifting thing for how we treat that in our industry.
Great, and we can maybe get into some of what worked well, what were some of the lessons learned from that experience. I'd like to now ask Mark, you have done a lot in this areas, and how do you think, first of all, if you could just give a little background on Yuri and all of the exciting things that are going on with your organization, but also, how can agriculture and nutrition industries really benefit from the space research? I mean, you've done it, you've seen it on the ground, and you've seen it up in space, and so what is your perspective there?
Yeah, first of all, thanks for having me, everyone. I'm Mark, one of the co-founders of Yuri. So we help companies, but also research institutions design manufacturing facility in the future to microgravity. And that is not limited only to orbital platforms like the ISS, but also to suborbital rockets or parabolic flights. We have even developed our own simulator, which is a clinostat that can kind of simulate microgravity on Earth, but also we have an RPM in the making where you have another way to simulate microgravity. How I think about the life sciences, so we're mostly focused purely on the life sciences, and currently we are kind of a lab as a service, helping others go to space. And we will move in the future also upwards in the value chain to also in partnership or even on our own, develop our own products and do our own science. What we think in agriculture, nutrition, it always has to have a effect than you have, and it needs to be really something that solves a problem. So we see a lot of projects or a lot of excitement with scientists that kind of want to do project just because it's in space and it's exciting, and we totally understand it can only be like sustainable and scalable if it solves a problem better than on Earth, and it's kind of a big problem that many people have. And so that could be, in our case, if you look at agriculture, like biologics discovery as well, like in kind of the pesticide herbicide area. So with better crystals, better crystallization, you can have kind of better biologics in the end. But also for plant resistance, it's interesting looking at plant growth. Is there any effects with the stress of space that we can assimilate and understand how plants work under stress on Earth and somehow maybe develop better crops or better kind of varieties of crops that are not possible on Earth. And so I think this is really important to look at it in this way. What is really a problem that we have on Earth, and we're really struggling with solving that, and then look at it, is space maybe an environment to do one of those? It's just like a Hilde with ice cubes that helps partnering with companies like ice cubes that really helps ambitious scientists on Earth to do amazing things in space.
Great, thanks, Mark. And so I think that was just a good transition to you, Hilde, and maybe a little bit of an overview of ice cubes, and maybe lead into some of the things Lucy was talking about. What are the stages when somebody has an idea or even has no idea? How do they come and have those conversations with an organization like Ice Cubes?
Yeah, thank you, Cindy. Yeah, so we set up our service called Ice Cubes a couple of years ago through a partnership with the European Space Agency to provide anybody access to space, and in particular to the space station and these fantastic assets that you guys and ladies talked about already of microgravity and radiation. So that basically all entities, whether they are familiar with space or not, can actually integrate these fabulous assets into their value chains that are relevant for R&D here on Earth. And so to use the space environment for the benefit of us, our Earthlings. So we have this facility on the International Space Station, and we accommodate a wide range of research and technologies that touch on the topics that we are here for today, but also others that maybe also Jonathan touched on, more on the physical science or more on the biotech science. And so we basically work and streamline processes with the Space Agency to provide direct and fast access to space. And so on your question, so suppose somebody has an idea. Well, I think Lucy already gave the very first, very important hint, is get in touch with her and her colleagues, and or in touch with people like Mark, like ourselves. And we are happy to discuss anything from a wild idea to a ready-to-fly experiment. We can talk with you about the feasibility of your experiment, and we can do that in support of Lucy, who obviously and her colleagues also have a great environment to do that, but also help you define what is the setup. As you mentioned, Cindy, when people will be doing their research in space, their setup will be different than what they are used to on the ground. And that translation of what is needed in space to make it work optimally, to give you results in space that are relevant for your research on Earth, as Mark well described, that's something where we can help you with. We can also talk about what are feasible launch times, and discuss with you what hardware you could use. So there's multiple options. you can either use hardware that has flown in the past, I mean, for example, Yuri also has good hardware that can serve also, for example, more cell biological, or that can, we also have hardware that we have flown in the past more for plants and so on. Or you can develop your own setup, either on your own or with the help of people that have developed for space. And so these are first steps, I think. What is important, what I want to iterate is that we are there to support you on the space processes. So you don't need to get and become fully knowledgeable of how a safety process for space work, but you can concentrate on your research, and the teams and the people that you see around here are there to support you from the space perspective, so that people from non-space can get access and utilize the assets of space.
Great.
Just to step in, you both mentioned that you were selecting as well project to make sure that it was making sense, that the result will bring something back for the population back on Earth. But then, is there another filter? Like, is the European agency able to say no just because of the place at some point and the number of research that can be conducted during a certain journey? Do they have a selection process as well? And do you support the companies to go through?
So maybe I can answer this question. There is two ways to have your payload, your experiment, able to flow in space, and they are not in a competition. But one way is to go through the regular process via the space agency, whether is it your national space agency or the European Space Agency or both. This is mostly dedicated to European consortium, scientific consortium for scientific research that are mostly focused on application on space, meaning really how plants behave in space for future exploration and so on, like topics that are identified in the roadmap of the agency because they are super useful. And for that, you apply. There is an open ITT. I think it's I'm looking at Hilde, every 4 years, 6 years? Not sure anymore.
It depends on the program.
It depends on the program, but you have like ITT and you're in competition, you build your consortium and you have a selection process. It's mostly, it's selected on the scientific merit. And then you get end-to-end support from the agency and all the ecosystem around to have your experiment done in space. And another way, but once again, I'm not opposing the two, it can work together. It's a kind of fast track to space, and you go through commercial space service providers such as IceCube, Yuri, and other. And here, the difference, it's of course you have to co-finance your experiment, and that's why it's not the same idea that is behind, but it's the same level of service. Hilde and Yuri and Mark, I'm speaking under your control. And so you come with your experiment. You have a selection process that is mostly by us. I don't know how to say that, but it's for you. We try to really push the project that will not make you lose money and that you will have a good result. So it's a kind of iterative process where we tailor the project to something that is feasible. And then you just get a contract with one of the space service provider. Of course, we can also always be in support. And you're never alone. You cannot do that alone. So you always have like a supporting team. And then it gets implemented a little bit faster. Hilde, Mark, do you have an idea of in how much time can your project fly, more or less? How is it the range of timing?
Yeah, so if you want to develop new hardware or a new setup, it's actually the time that it takes to develop that is the driver. Typically for us, if we want to fly new hardware, we would manifest it. That means reserve a spot on a vehicle around 11, 12 months before that flight. However, if we are using hardware that has flown in the past, and for example, we have a protein crystallization incubator, there we can define samples actually 3-4 months before a flight. So it really depends on the accommodation that you want to use, and what needs to be developed, how much time ahead we start talking.
Same for us. I think we have the hardware ready. So our record is really from signature launch about 4 months, where we have a hardware ready off the shelf. As Hilde said, if we have something that we need to develop, then we have to go through a more complex safety process. Talking about filters, as you said, Lucy, I think one big filter is safety. You cannot fly everything, anything explosive or that could hurt the astronaut. It's always a bit tricky.
For sure.
But so far, we have always found ways to fly asked for. Scientific is also ways right now, but yeah, this is also a bit more expensive and a bit more tricky. But if you really have a scientific question, it's all about slide down to what do we already have that makes things easier and quicker, and then, as I said, we always find ways to launch it in the quickest way possible.
And that leads me to a question to Vic, because you have you experiment kind of different way to have your different service provider to have your experiment fly on the International Space Station, or were you aware of the usual, I guess, NASA, ITT? How did it work for you, and why did you make that choice somehow to go through cases?
Yeah, no, it's been great to hear both you and Hilde talk about it, because with the way you've described it, and Mark as well, was our experience. One of the things you mentioned, Lucy, you said, that you guys can help with that front end ideation workshop. I would say from our experience, that was critical. We brought Jonathan and the team in, and we put together internally in our company about 30 proposals, and we let cases then kind of guide us through what are the one that's really going to, Mark, I think you said it, right? What is the one that's going to answer the big problem, and not just something that you want to do because it's cool science. And so that was a really helpful piece up front to hone in on what is the one that's going to have the most return on investment and the most likely chance of success. And then the other piece that was huge was that service partner. And so we worked with a company called Bioserve that had a biofilm device that was already approved and off the shelf. And we made some tweaks to it. But because of their experience and their help in the process, it really made our lives a lot easier to walk through step by step of the process. So from our perspective, really good experience all around.
Okay, but I think you mentioned something very important. It's the fact that we have IceCube and URI today, but there is lots of service provider. And how I see it, and for us at the French Space Agency, at Connect Likeness, and at MEDES, we are neutral. And what we will try to do is really help you find the perfect fit for the perfect payload. And we have seen it that there is some service providers that have specific assets or specific sub-instruments that are super tailored to your experiment. We provide guidance. You're free to follow it or not. I mean, it's a free market. You're free to have a contract with whoever you find suitable. But our goal is really to be super neutral, to look at your need, to look, and I'm pretty sure, Hilde and Mark, that you are in the same way, because we all want the success of the project. But it's to go to the service provider, say, what you have in terms of offer, and to help you select what we think could be the best fit. But after that, you're free to choose whichever service provider you like. I mean, it's how we intend to implement it.
Yeah, and I think that's also coming back to your question, Anne-Charlotte. So I don't think we do necessarily a screening or a selection on our side, but I think also the way Mark phrased it, I think it's in all of our interest that the research that you propose generates the results that you want from it. That's relevant for you, as Vic said, for the companies that are doing this R&D, but that's also relevant for us as service providers that returns good results. So there's no screening as such, but we would indeed look like, as Lucy is explaining, can we help you? Do we have assets that are specific to what you are needing? Or are we better off telling you that there's other colleagues that have better, more suitable assets?
And that based on the list that Anne-Charlotte you showed at the very beginning with One Health and omics and chronic diseases. You know, each one of those, I think we sort of talked about today in terms of why low Earth orbit, why microgravity. But what Vic said, I think, is key, which is those ideation, brainstorming sessions that we have at the beginning of why microgravity, why low Earth orbit, what does that do to chronic disease? What does that do to omics technologies? What does that do to the link between animals, plants, and humans? And really coming up with a list, you know, that list of companies that we showed you that have all done work in, you know, we walked into those companies on day one. Nobody thought that space was relevant to them based on what they did on the ground. But by the time we finished those brainstorming ideation sessions, we had lists, like Vic just said, 40 projects, 50 projects. And it really then was a process to say, which ones mean the most to your company in terms of your investment, and which ones are the most feasible in low Earth orbit. We also been done, because if something's already been studied in space, you don't want to just do the same thing. That's not advancing anything. Really looking at all those pieces and coming, what is that optimal, you know, intersection that aligns with or your organizational goals, and what is the most feasible in space? So I think those were great questions. I don't know, Anne Charlotte, if that actually your question, but I'm excited by this topic area of agronutrition, what the goals of your organization are, and some of the folks that are on this webinar, because I think that there's such a big bullseye of relevant topics.
Yeah,
you know,
definitely. I mean, having different conditions to experiment, the fact that the microbes, the bacteria especially, behave totally differently in space, that's for sure a great opportunity to identify some cutting-edge innovation. But then, I mean, I'm used to work a lot with companies, and it's always a challenge sometimes to convince them, building up a research program with local academia people. So I'm sure that thinking about, okay, let's send our research into space, that can be a bit scary. It's I guess it's very nice from a communication perspective, because you can be sure that you can generate a buzz if you send some samples there. You can communicate on the fact that you are very innovative if you even dare to go to space to conduct part of your research. But at the end of the day, you also need to turn it into concrete innovation, concrete value for your own company. And I think the trade-off must be a bit scary for most of the companies at the beginning. So it's interesting to see that there are some partners to drive you through the process and help you select, and that at the end of the day, it is feasible. And some companies do send some samples there. So that's very interesting. I also had a question about the management of intellectual property for those projects that access through partners and not directly through research consortia. Is there at some point, if there is a cutting-edge innovation coming from this research, is there a need to share the IP with the space agency, or is it totally owned by the company that has built, at the end of the day, the program?
Yeah, to come back maybe to Lucy, her two routes. So the more academic science that goes through the agencies, and then the second route that I think we're mainly addressing today, which is the fast track route that allows you also, I mean, to co-finance and then go in a fast track. There, I think the IP ownership stays with the company, with the user. On our side, we just, for example, in terms of data, we have a way that allows you to send commands to your setup in space to get data down real time, but that's through a secure VPN tunnel. So you're the only one that sees those data, and you own those data, also the IP rights that can generate it from that. So yeah, I think it's very important for companies to ensure that.
Yeah, and maybe throw that one to Vic as well, which is, you know, I'm sure the IP was very important to your organization, and you know, what were the outcomes of what you did, and were there bigger implications for the petroleum microbiology area?
Yeah, and the IP for us was a little bit different because it was more of a knowledge IP. And the intent was to understand what it was about the biofilms that kicked off the corrosion process, and then use that to decide how and when do we actually treat in the field. So very much a knowledge play, but you're right, that knowledge then stayed with us after the flight. Really interesting from our perspective. You know, when we did the flight, we went through and tried to de-risk all of the variables. We actually ran the entire experiment on the ground, step by step, to make sure that we knew exactly how to load it, how to run it, how to unload it. And we had some great learnings along the way. And one of the complicating things, especially with microorganisms, is you then got to set up your experiment a day before, 2 days before the launch, right? Because you're working with live microbes that you've got to prep. And so that was a really interesting one for us, because when we got on site to do it, the anaerobic chamber that we used to set up this experiment was very different than the one we had used in our lab. And that was a variable that we missed in the de-risk process. And so we flew it, it came back. And at first we were really shocked, because the biofilms, both on Earth and in microgravity, that had grown amazingly well in all of our ground test work, not a single organism grew. It was completely nothing, both in Earth and in microgravity. And you would say, oh, well, it was a failure. No, it wasn't a failure. We learned some really interesting insights about the impact of very low part per billion levels of oxygen on the biofilms we were growing, and what impact that has on how we deal with petroleum microbiology. So it wasn't the outcome we were expecting, but it still gave us some really interesting insights, and has given us kind of a new series of questions to probe going forward.
Great. Great. And Mark, what about, you know, your view? What do you say to people if they say to you that just doing something in space is an expensive hobby? I mean, have you had that same kind of real results that you've seen your you know, partners using URI type hardware achieve?
Yeah, as I said in the beginning, I think this is always, from non-space people, maybe the critical question. Okay, is it just kind of, you know, for fun or expensive hobby, or just because it's exciting? Obviously it is, but definitely, and there's been 20 years of research now on the ISS. In the past 10 years, a lot of them was very commercial. I think there's countless examples that we can always show, and that you also showed in your presentation before, to say, look, this company did this and improved it by X%, or this had this amazing result. I mean, Merck in the US is always a great example, but also others. In Germany, we have Adidas, like a sports company, like that has 2 experiments already with very interesting results. We visited their future lab a few months ago, and so we have lots of experiment to kind of they have answered to that critique. But of course, I wouldn't say 100% of all emissions right now are all like purely scientific with a clear kind of dollar behind it that comes out of it. But that's fine, I think. I mean, we all kind of are curious people that want to understand the basic science of it. But I think we have to be very careful also towards the public, that we spend the money wisely and spend it on things that are real problems and that can really move us forward.
Mm. You know, Vic talked about the outcomes in petroleum microbiology. Do you have any, you know, specific examples of agronutrition or health-related research that's been done with ice cubes that you can share with the group?
Yeah, we had one of our very first cubes that we flew was actually a small greenhouse that allowed, and Molly touched on that, to look into stressors for plant growth. So I think it's a nice example. We actually had one using URI hardware related to biomining, for example. I mean, that was more in direction of exploration, but I think it's also relevant for Earth in the sense of how bacteria can, in this case, help to produce methane. I also mentioned we have this regular protein crystallization incubator that we fly, which I think is also in the context of agronutrition, I think is also relevant, and that's very easy in terms of access. And in August, we're flying also a genetics experiment related to skin microbiome of type 2 diabetes samples, for example, just to give some ideas. And I think we're also working on some food of the future related R&D setups. So I think that's also very interesting, what can be flying in the future as setups or platforms related to specifically food and how that will evolve.
Great. And Lucy, I think there might be questions coming from the participants. Do you take the one about the fast track and regular process?
Yeah, but I would like another question. Ask another question to Cyril. Can you explain what is behind your questions? Can you voice your question a little bit more into detail? Cyril, are you here? Are you able to speak? That's a good question. Okay. I don't know if you hear us, Cyril, but basically maybe you will see that in the replay. So regular process, fast track to space, it's quite a bad wording, to be honest. I should have said maybe, you don't find the mic. You don't have the small mic thing? That's a stupid question. If you don't find the mic, it means that you don't have the small mic thing. I don't know how to help you. Pierre, are you here? Can you help Cyril? It's terrible, you know, with this webinar, when you're in your room, you're able to interact. Here, you're like shooting in the...
So Lucy, I think only the panelists can speak, so I don't think they can. I don't think she can.
Sorry, Cyril. So I will have to guess, and you just interact. Okay. It was a good explanation. So basically, it's not fast track and regular processes. How before all this space service provider, there was only one way to be implemented in space, and it was through the agency. It's a very a strict process that is quite well known for all the science community, and it's very useful. And we had lots of successful experiments. And it's just an addition. Right now, there is other way to fly to space, and this is what we would like to present here. And it has advantages and drawbacks with respect to the space agency way. We try to work more and more together, meaning that we have seen some projects sponsored by the space agency, but they choose to have them implemented through, for example, IceCube or URI for various reasons. And what the message here is that there is multiple ways to go to space. And once again, do not hesitate to come to talk with us. We represent both, Hilde and myself, we were working both in the ISS program for European Space Agency. So if the better fit for your project, what you want to know is to go through the agency, we won't hesitate to accompany you, to help you, and we can also go all together to the agency. So I'm not opposing the two ways, it's just that now we have multiple possibilities. And thank you for your question, because I think it was worth mentioning, and I hope my colleague here agree with what I just said.
Great. And so while we're waiting, and I think it was just a reminder, if anybody, any of the participants have questions, please type them into the chat. And maybe while we're waiting for that, Vic, I think it would be great to just get a little bit more from you on what was the process like? You know, what kind of validation did you do before you went to space? What was it like working with NASA, you know, side, or the service providers, or the ISS National Lab? You know, how did that work and feel from you being not a company focused on space prior to that?
Yeah, you know, so this was our first experience, right? So we came into this not knowing what to expect. We spent a pretty significant time in that upfront phase. We talked about the ideation, the brainstorming. We spent about 6 months working with cases really to pick the right project, because we knew if we didn't pick the right thing up front, then everything else we did was going to suffer because of that. So we spent a lot of time there. And then you heard from Hilda and Mark kind of about how long it takes to do the implementation piece. Ours was about 9 months, so it's not like it was kind of on average, not the fastest, not super slow, but that's because we took off-the-shelf hardware and made some tweaks to it. And so it took us about 9 months to work with the hardware and to run the experiment. The actual experiment that we ran was about a 1 month experiment. So to run that full experiment, process everything through, make sure it all looked right, and made some tweaks along the way. But what we found was the guidance that we got from the organizations, both the partners that we worked with, BioServe, as well as cases, really guided us through all those pieces that we would not have known. And somebody earlier said the safety protocols. Absolutely. They understand those things. They know it has to be done. And so you don't have to go figure that out. So those pieces were really helpful to go through the process. Working with the astronauts, that was a great experience as well. Training them on how to do the experiment, how to start it, how to stop it. What if something happens? How do I deal with that? So that was really very positive experiences, kind of all around from beginning to end. And from our side, working both with cases and our service partner, we could not have done this successfully without them. So really grateful to both of them for their help.
Great, good. As we talk about going forward, and I think Lucy did a great job today talking about, what does CNES as the space agency really focus on versus, working directly with a URI or in ice cubes. And maybe Mark, this is for you. What do you think about the future of an organization doing sort of just direct commercial work in space? And when I say commercial, I don't mean, the marketing, branding, commercial, but just the work to support their organization from a research, development, manufacturing. Where do you see that going?
I think activities will definitely increase, platforms increase. So people think, okay, this will all stop now that the ISS is very old. But we see a lot of new exciting platforms coming up, free flying capsules, new orbital planes entering the game, which is great for everyone who wants to do research and manufacturing there, because prices will drop, more access will happen, more kind of things will be allowed, for example, especially for autonomous capsules, because you don't have any crew on them. So like the safety aspects are less strict than maybe on the ISS, and you don't have an astronaut cycling beside your experiment, which might interfere with the microgravity. So I think it's a very exciting future ahead. And now it really depends on, as I said several times already, we have to focus on problems that are really relevant. And as said, we're now moving into that direction, going more towards a partner model where we collaborate with those scientists. And as Lucy said, regarding the IP, we also try to share IP, together do this and invest ourselves into the own science. And we're heading, and it will be probably less about fundamental research. We answered a lot of fundamental questions the past 20 years. I think the next 20 years will be all about, with that answers we have now, commercialize them, make them big, and really provide value to lots and lots of people. And that's what we're especially very.
Great. And so it looks like more questions on the Q&A piece as opposed to the chat. And from Emmanuel, we've got the question, what is the average cost of an in-orbit experiment? So I think this could go to us. Lucy, I don't know if you want to take it, or Hilda or Mark.
Difficult for me to answer this question. The only thing that I can say, and then I will leave the floor to Hilda or Mark, is what we are trying to do. It's to initiate, to help this commercial activity. And so we are trying with the European Space Agency to co-found 50% of the average envelope, meaning that you still have to find co-founding for the 50 remaining percent, either from yourself or from like other sponsors or whatever. However, for the overall costs, I suspect that it highly depends on your experiment and what Hilda and Mark said. If it's hardware that is already there and space certified somehow, I guess it could be cheaper. And that's why also you can have faster access to space. And if you have to redevelop the entire hardware, redo the safety, it could be more expensive. However, for correct number, I will leave the question to Hilde and Mark.
Okay, shall I get started, Mark, and then you can...
you do the best.
And then Mark will come in a few euro below you.
And then I'll buy with Mark. So for Emmanuel, so he's asking about an average cost. So I mean, it can really range depending on the setup, as the folks were already saying. So it can start from as low, I would say, of a couple of thousands if you're flying some samples in a shared setup. A typical for us, if we're talking about a 1 U cube, that it means a 1 unit of 10 by 10 by 10 centimeters, which is kind of the minimal setup. For the service, you have to think around 45K euro, and there you would need to you add then the development cost. And as Cindy was saying, or Lucy was saying, that depends a lot of if it's a new development or not. If you're thinking a bit bigger and you want to, for example, fly a cell biological setup that requires for thermal conditioning, requires maybe for analysis instruments integrated in your setup, I think you need to think more of in the range of the 100, 150K, just to give some ideas. And so the average you can choose to calculate. Mark, I don't know if you want to add to that a bit from your end.
Yeah, for us it's always 10% lower, of course, what Hilde said. No, just kidding. No, I think that's estimate. So you can make very tiny, maybe lots of high school. You can really be in the thousands, but it's between 50 to 150K for simple experiment. Like the 100K, we can already do standardized hardware cell biology experiments, but we also do have agency project $500 million where you really have like 18 bioreactors and very complex and like high numbers of and very, very precise temperature control. And so yeah, anywhere between really thousands to 1 million. And so it's a huge range.
Yeah, it really depends.
I'm happy to share our personal experience as well. So when we first put out the bids, we were thinking of a little bit of a larger experiment with multiple sets of experiments. And when it came back, we knew what our budget was, and it was higher than that. And so we trimmed down the experiment a bit. And so our total cost was about 130,000 euros. And that was to fly the experiment both in microgravity and do the exact same experiment on Earth. So we had duplicates. And then Lucy also mentioned the importance of getting outside funding. And so we had an outside funding to help cover part of that as well. So that brought that cost down a bit, but that's what it was for us.
Yeah. And I would say that's pretty typical of what we've seen in those ranges. So that's great. There's another question from Ben. Do you all see your customer base for in-orbit experiments being primarily public space agencies or private companies moving forward?
That's a nice question. I will be very happy to hear the answer from Hilde and Mark.
So I think to answer to Ben, so I also wanted to still mention that I think one of the main challenges typically we see is awareness. And I think what is crucial is that these different sectors talk to each other and learn their respective languages, and we don't work in a space silo and then a food silo or an agronutrition silo, but that we really talk to each other. And why I say that is because I think, I very much think, and we see that happening, that more and more there will be non-space industry making use of these assets of space for application-oriented R&D activities. We see the space agencies as a kind of anchor customer, but yeah, if you ask the question that you ask, I would say I expect that there will be a gradual increase of the relative part that will be taken by companies doing R&D, so more the private companies, gradually more and more, I would say.
And while Mark maybe comes back to this, just Lucy, to your point, you know, you're excited to see what the answer is. On the U.S. side, you know, we started the ISS National Lab activity in 2011, and it was really 0% commercial utilization. And when I left the National Lab in 2018, over 55% of the users were commercial companies that were, you know, paying that kind of money that Vic just talked about to support their doing that type of work in space. So we saw, and it was kind of a hockey stick. It was slow at the beginning, but then we really saw a big increase in that commercial usage for their own terrestrial purposes, which we, to Lucy's point, you know, we thought was really a great outcome.
I think there is a last question. Oh, sorry, Mark. Go ahead.
Sorry, apologies. My battery is running low, so I need to run to get the charger. Maybe to add on that, I think, yeah, of course, everyone is kind of dreaming and hoping for this huge commercial market, and everyone like hopes that the big chunk of the industry will be commercial, and we believe as well. What we realize now in the first kind of years is that it's kind of a chicken egg problem, right? So first companies are doing it and see promising results, but they're always a bit hesitant to really invest the big money into creating the data and creating big use cases. And that's why we on ourselves decided to break this chicken and egg and really go that step into partly doing it ourselves, because we still see some hesitation from big companies to really put in the big budgets. And that's why I think you need to have those many success stories and those big success stories that other companies and the whole industry is following lead.
So we have 2 minutes left. There's a super last question. I think then we'll need to wrap up. Question from Emmanuel. Have you already identified co-founding support from EC Horizon called Europe? Alors, my specialist of the Horizon Europe program is online, Marie-Laure, but she cannot speak, I guess. To my knowledge, there is no dedicated call for that particular type of activity. However, if you look in the different cluster or pillar, I don't remember the name exact of that, you can, what I would recommend, but just an idea, it's to build a primary focus towards terrestrial innovation with a work package that is built together either with us or with the service provider that you have already identified, that tackle, you know, common knowledge that can be applied both for on Earth and in space. I would not recommend, there is no dedicated call for science in microgravity to my knowledge in the Horizon program, Horizon Europe program. But for example, if it's the same for the Green Deal and all this kind of thing, this address fundamental problems that are common to both space and Earth. And I would focus the project and the consortium on terrestrial application with the market, with a clear terrestrial return of investment, and add a work package for space application. I don't know if this is the right answer, but this is what I would do.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. Supporting in the building of collaborative projects, that would make sense to de-risk the project.
Exactly.
And it's time to close, I think. I see that I don't know if it's going to shut down our screen in one way. So maybe I will like to thank all our speakers for taking the time today to share their knowledge, to ask their question. Thank you very much. I think it was really interesting. I would also like to thank the audience for all the questions. And once again, if you have any questions, so there will be a replay on our Connect by CNES website. You will receive a link, and do not hesitate to reach any of us if you have any question, and we will exchange all together and try to make successful project, I hope. So thank you very much, and thank you, Molly, Jonathan, and Cynthia for the organization. It's always perfect. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lucy.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye-bye. I
Thank
forgot
you.
to
Bye,
mention, next week, we are doing the same exercise on cosmetic. So spread the word, completely different topic.
Thank you. Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you very much.